This is the front page of the Sunday Telegraph out of London. Ministers to deal with Iran for captives. We want to hear from you for the next half hour about how you think the British should react to to Iran for the taking of the soldiers. So there are the numbers on the screen: Republicans, Democrats, Independents. How should Britain respond to Iran? We want to hear from you. We'll go through some articles and some different responses, and we'll be right back. From Tehran. He's with the Los Angeles Times, and he'll be talking about this story. We'll also have on the set Niall Gardner from the Heritage Foundation. Used to be an advisor to Margaret Thatcher, and he feels that this was an aggressive act of war. We'll get his views on that. And finally, we are going to be talking about Sudan at 9:30 with Senior Representative to the country of Sudan from the State Department, and that's Lauren Landis. So that's what's coming up in the Journal. Again, you can see the numbers there on the screen. What we want to talk about for the next half hour: please allow 30 days between your calls. Journal@cspan.org is our email address. This is in the Washington Times. Bush calls detention of 15 Britons inexcusable. Said it was inexcusable behavior, called for their immediate release. That's that story. In the Washington Post, elite Revolutionary Guard broadens its influence in Iran. This is Robin Wright writing for the Post. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps, the elite unit at the heart of the latest Middle East crisis, has greater power today than at any point since the revolution's early days to export Islamic militancy and challenge the West's presence in the region, say U.S. officials and Iran experts. Its naval forces abducted 15 British soldiers. Its special forces unit is operating deep in Iraq, providing militias with deadly roadside explosives used against American troops, U.S. officials say. It supplied missiles used by Hezbollah last summer in the longest war Arabs ever fought with Israel, and it now plays the largest role in Iran's ambitious military industries, including attempted acquisitions of nuclear weapons and surface-to-surface missiles. That's according to an upcoming book by Anthony Cordesman of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But almost 3 decades after the 1979 revolution, the Revolutionary Guard has also become a leading political and economic force in Iran. One of its veterans, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, became Iran's president in 2005. The force and a network of current and former commanders have also moved into Iran's oil and gas business, won bids on major government construction contracts, and even gained lucrative franchises such as the Mercedes-Benz dealerships, the sources say. First call up on what should Great Britain do in response to Iran comes from Wilmington, Delaware, on a Republican line. Wilmington helps to push the button. Wilmington, go ahead.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, sirs. I think the Iran is a little cash-strapped right now, to be quite honest, and the seizure of all their assets in Britain and all British territories would be the first move, followed secondly and swiftly by a naval blockade of all gasoline imports, which they're 40% dependent upon because they don't have refineries. They already have the naval forces in place to do a blockade with the assistance of some American help. I think that would be in proper form.
Clinton, Maryland, Democrat. What do you think the British response to Iran should be?
I think the Britain and the United States should keep one thing in mind, and I think they're thinking about it. It's called the Straits of Hormuz. If that's a small area, if the war starts, that area will be blocked off. There would be no oil imports coming from that area. It could precipitate a world economic crisis. I think they should try to negotiate this. Maybe the British troops were in the wrong area. I don't know, but negotiations, I think, would probably solve this problem. I'd like to say one other thing while I'm on the phone here. I've been against President Bush for a long time, and I think it's a bad mistake for him to go into that area. But President Bush is a victim as well as the rest of us. He's being used by the military-industrial complex, and he does not have the wherewithal to deal with it. So he's a victim as well as we are. And he needs to listen to that gentleman. His name is Mr. Dowd, who's trying to tell him the right way to get out of this situation. Thank you.
Burton, Ohio, independent. You're on the air. What should the British do in response to the Iran?
Well, I think what they should do is do what they're doing now, mainly not overreacting, being calm. One must remember that a U.S. naval ship blasted an Iranian airliner out of the sky years ago. These international incidents happen. And I think listening to Tony Blair, he's calm. He realizes that he has lives at stake. He's well aware of that, he said, and he will do everything to get it back. And I think he'll track a diplomatic route that eventually will work. And I think in comparison, if one thinks if it was Americans, what our response might be, and I think it would be quite different and quite disastrous.
Henderson, Texas, Republican. You're on the air.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Hi.
They were not in, the caller before said they were in Iranian waters. The GPS system has put them, the British soldiers, GPS, global positioner, since they're in not Iranian waters, but the Iraqi water, okay? Anyway, we're stuck. I voted for President Bush in the first year, okay? The first year. I never voted for him the second time, okay? Anyway, we're stuck in a quagmire in Iraq. We can't help Britain right now, okay?
Well,
but
what do you think the British should do? What do you think the British should do?
We need all the help we can get as far as the British. The British are there. They've captured their soldiers in Iran, and I think British should go in and get their soldiers back. I really do. If it starts the war, it starts the war because Iran's going to start a war eventually with either the United States, with Britain, or Israel. So, you know, it's eventually going to happen. So,
okay.
British is...
Thank you for that call. Front page of the Sunday Telegraph out of London this morning. And by the way, our international line is open in case you'd like to call in and talk about this story. We'll put that number on the screen. Ministers seek deal with Iran for captives. The British government is preparing a compromise deal to allow Iran to save face and release its 15 British military captives by promising that the Royal Navy will never knowingly enter Iranian waters without permission. The Sunday Telegraph has learnt of plans to send a Royal Navy captain or commodore to Tehran as a special envoy of the government to deliver a public assurance that officials hope will end the diplomatic standoff. The Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary Margaret Beckett have been warned that the impasse may develop into a long-term standoff. Privately, officials are speculating that the crisis could continue for months. Iran's ambassador to Moscow announced that legal moves to determine the guilt of the British soldiers have been launched. In an interview with a Russian television channel, he said, "The legal process is going on and has to be completed, and if they are found guilty, they will face punishment." Mount Kisco, New York, Democrat.
Yes, hello. Thank you for C-SPAN, first of all. I wanted to say I'm originally from Iran. We left immediately after the revolution, and I still go back and forth to visit other relatives and such. And I almost rarely come across anyone who supports the government there. Everybody hates the government. Everybody's unhappy. The level of poverty is out of control. And there are some TV stations, mostly out of L.A., satellite TV stations, that try to help the people organize to overthrow the government, but they're very low in funding, and they're all going out of business.
Is that Reza Pahlavi's group that does that?
No, actually, unfortunately, he's not that active. Most of the people would support him, but he just gives speeches here and there, but he doesn't have a TV station or a regular radio.
Have you talked to any family in Iran since this happened?
Yes, actually, I'm going back there next week.
Is it getting big play in the media?
I talk to family in Iran almost every day, and everybody's
Is it getting
very
big play?
unhappy.
Is it getting big play in the media over in Iran?
It's getting some play, but they really make it sound as though the British were at fault. So
Right.
all of the media is completely controlled by the government. There's absolutely no free media in Iran. So whatever they hear is completely lopsided and not the truth. And what they can really get a help out of is if they let the stations out of L.A., get some funding so that they can reach the Iranian people and help
All right.
them organize.
Thank you, caller. Iran delivers letter protesting alleged shooting incident in Iraq. This is from the Associated Press from a couple hours ago. Iran has sent a letter to the British Embassy in Tehran asking Britain to respect international laws regarding diplomatic buildings. Iran's state news agency reports the letter protests an alleged incident in which British troops surrounded an Iranian consulate in Iraq and fired shots into the air. Iran has reportedly asked Britain to prevent such actions in the future. Britain denies any aggressive action. And also from the Associated Press, a poll by the British newspaper The Telegraph finds that 66% of respondents trust Britain's government will be able to resolve the crisis, while 28% don't think so. Cookeville, Tennessee, you're on the air.
Good morning, Peter, and thanks
Hi.
for taking my call. You know, I think we have to look at the total picture of what this is really about. Right now, there's a lot of pressure on Iran because of its nuclear program. I think this is where for them to strike back in some areas. But this all goes back to the heart and soul of foreign policy of Jimmy Carter 27 years ago. I think this is probably the biggest blunder in this country. He made a huge mistake. He backed Khomeini rather than back Shah. And ever since then, we've had an enemy rather than a... But ask me what we would do in this situation. I don't know the total situation, but it reminds me so much of the captives we had there in Iran 27 years ago. How you can get around that is the very part. You try military force. I don't think that's going to work. I think most of the Iranian people are good people. They really want their freedom, but you have to find some way to deal with it. It's ironic that he did not attach American forces because we have such a large presence right now as far as sea power right there in that area. So I think that's ironic.
Arlington, Virginia, independent. What do you think the British response to Iran should be?
Well, first of all, I'd like to suggest something I haven't heard anyone discuss, and that is the question that you might almost call it international religious discrimination. Every major religion in the world has a country that has atomic weapons. You take the Christian religions, the Anglican, Protestant, Catholic, and Orthodox all have atomic weapons. The Sunni Muslims, in the case of Pakistan, has atomic weapons. The Shia are the only major religion without atomic weapons. Even the Israelis, the Jewish religion, has atomic weapons. So I think the Iranians must be particularly sensitive on this whole question. They regard themselves as a great power, and I think we should attempt to respect the fact that they are a major power in dealing with them and not brush them off. That's my point.
All right. Do you think they should be allowed to have atomic weapons?
Well, I think that some consideration should be given in terms of the fact that they're a major religion without atomic weapons, plus the fact that we're trying to deal with Iraq, where the majority religion is also Shia. They must feel like they're and their fellow religionists are being shoved away, or not treated equally with the rest of the world. That's the point.
Thank you, caller. Next call is from London. London, go ahead. What do you think your country's response to Iran should be?
Oh.
London, you're on the air.
Oh, good morning.
Hi.
Or afternoon. Thanks for C-SPAN, by the way. I do enjoy it.
Okay, caller. London, turn down the volume on your TV. Otherwise, we're going to have stops and starts here. Okay, go ahead and turn down the volume on your TV. And then we'll go ahead and hear your comments on what you think your country's response to Iran should be.
Is that better?
Go ahead and talk.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think our British government are handling the matter in a diplomatic sense. But, you know, where the sailors were, I think, is by the by. Had there been goodwill, I think they would have been arrested and released very, very quickly, within hours. There is an example of this, by the way. When the troubles in Northern Ireland occurred, several British soldiers strayed across the border, were arrested by the Irish police, but you had two governments that were, should I say, in a friendly relationship. They were arrested, and within 2 hours they were on their way back after a quick apology from their commanding officer. Easily solved. Now, I feel that there's something deeper with Iran. I think they're holding those sailors and Marines as pawns in a bigger game.
But so far you're satisfied with how Tony Blair has handled this?
Yes, I think he's done the right thing. I mean...
Do you think there should at any point be a military response?
I hope not, no, because I don't really think a conflagration in the Middle East is what we want.
All right. What kind of attention is this story still getting in Great Britain?
Oh,
Are people talking about it also?
Oh, yes. A lot of people, of course, are very bellicose. They want to, I've heard people say, oh, we should go in and nuke them. I don't think that would be much of a solution. No, I think diplomatic efforts are the best thing. And, of course, in the meantime, Iran will do what they do very well. They'll use them for propaganda purposes.
What do you do in London?
I'm retired now, sir.
From? From what profession?
I was in the computer industry with, you heard of NCR?
Yes, it used to be National Cash Register out of Dayton, right?
That's correct, Dayton, Ohio.
Right.
So, hence, and of course I have family in America.
All right. Well, thanks for watching C-SPAN, and thank you for calling in this morning. Newport, Kentucky Democrat, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Good morning, Peter.
Hi.
You are always so well put together. It's a joy to watch you. You dress so well. But that's not my point this morning. I think the British are handling this well. I think that they really need to quietly negotiate with Iran. And I really think that the United States and the President and our administration really has said enough, and they need to stop with their bellicose conversation, their ratcheting up of the tensions in that area, and let the British handle this situation. It's their sovereign country. Let them negotiate for their own people. And, you know, it just scares me because Cy Hirsch came out with that article in the New Yorker where we might have we were looking at April as a time to maybe have some kind of incursion in Iran, or to go into Iran. And the timing of this just seems a little suspicious, and I'm not usually a person that is a conspiratorial thinker, but, you know, if you really look at that area where the waterway is so narrow in that area, that I could see that maybe they crossed the line. So I'm not sure who really is right, but I think just quiet diplomacy is the best way to go, and I think the United States has its hands full right now, and if we would just be quiet, I think that might be more helpful. Thank you.
Thank you for calling in. Next call is from Jersey City, New Jersey, Republican. How do you think the British should respond to Iran?
Well, I think after a week, they probably should have went in militarily. It seems like the military, it seems like they're not able to respond. I've been concerned about Britain's build down of their navy. They may have. It seems like they've gone too far in their build down, and maybe they're not able to respond militarily anymore. And I think the build down of the British Navy is sad from a historical standpoint, and it's not good from a current standpoint tactically. So, but I would favor a military. I would like to see them do a military response. On your last segment, I had just mentioned to the screener that in the talk, when talking about presidents, there was one other president who served as the mayor, was Andrew Johnson, who actually was the only president to go through every seat of government between councilman and president. So, just for your information.
And we were right, though,
like the show.
Thank you. We were right, though, that Grover Cleveland was the last elected mayor at some point in his career to have served as president.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No,
Then
I'm glad to have the
misunderstood.
information. No, that's great. So we have two of them, right?
As far as I know, yes, sir.
Okay. Thanks so much for that information. That was great. Wales, you're on C-SPAN.
Hi there. How are you today?
Good.
Well, one of the biggest issues I think in the media in this country, when I say this country being the UK, to do with the 15 people who have been captured, is that we keep on concentrating a lot on the female personnel, specifically the one woman involved here. Now, what we've got to remember is that there are 14 other families involved. I have people in the UK military as friends, and they have said to me that they think that this is an overt concentration on one individual and could actually counter women's role in the military if something were to go wrong. But as far as my own country's response is, I think that Tony Blair is doing a bang-up job, supporting the democratic way of doing things, which is to negotiate. But I do also believe that if time should run out, I think that we need to be prepared to use whatever means necessary to secure the release of our Navy personnel, and I hope that the U.S. will be there to support us in that role.
So you could see military action of some type?
If they do not, if they prosecute them, and if they put them through a trial of propaganda, embarrassment, and it gets to the stage where they might not be released, then yeah, I can see it coming to an end game special where... Are
people that you're talking to, people that you associate with, are they angry about this?
Yeah, many of them actually would love to get their 50-pound packs on and march straight to Tehran now and remove them. Remove the 15 personnel and bring them back to safety, and that's the way that they're thinking.
Thank you for calling in this morning. Little Rock, Arkansas Democrat, what do you think the British response to Iran should be?
Well, I think that Tony Blair is doing what he should be doing. It looked a little iffy at first, like he kind of wanted to go to war, which made it look a little bit suspicious because if you look at it, Israel attacked Lebanon, we attacked Iraq. Now I guess it would seem like it's Tony Blair's time now to attack Iran, and Israel already said that they wanted Iran to be taken care of before this administration is over. So that would make it look a little suspicious. So I hope he stays on the diplomatic line. Thank you.
Thank you for calling in. Saratoga, New York, Independent.
Yeah, good morning.
Hi.
I think this has to be solved diplomatically. I was served in the Navy, and this goes on all the time. We go, I believe it's 12 nautical miles is the limit. And when you're watching a country or observing something that's going on, we do this all the time. We'll go 12 miles and 100 feet past the line. And so just saying that the British were right is they got to diplomatically solve this, because they could have made a mistake and gone too close. We used to do it when I was in. We'd go to Libya, we'd go to El Salvador, and that's how we spy on countries. You get as close as you can, and you intercept all their communications. So you don't know if they were wrong or if they were right. It's got to be diplomatic. We can't have military actions every time. I mean, people got to learn their lessons. When we fight these tiddly countries, we're not proving anything when we beat them. I mean, we can go in and we can crush them, and then we're stuck with the bill. We're stuck rebuilding them. We're stuck babysitting. This is what's going on in Iraq. Now, of course, we can crush them. We're the greatest power, but it doesn't prove anything. Same thing with Vietnam. It turns into a big mess.
This is a map that was in the New York Times last week, and this is the area that we're talking about right here, right near the border of Iraq and Iran, right there. And up here they have a showing of the water boundary, and this is where the first Iranian reported position was. It was on the Iraqi side. If we can get in a little closer, please. You can see here that this was the corrected Iraqi position, or Iranian position, right here on the other side of the line. Last call on this topic. Well, we're going to spend another half hour on it, but last call here during open phones. Sheridan, Wyoming.
Hello.
Hi.
I just had a rather novel idea.
All right, I'm going to put you on hold. We're going to let you turn down the volume on your TV, and we're going to come right back to you. Whoops, we lost her. So we are now joined by Borzu Deragahi, who is in Tehran. He's with the Los Angeles Times. Mr. Deragahi, what kind of media is this story getting?
Well, you mean in Iran domestically?
In Iran domestically, correct.
Well, I mean, it's, right now is the Persian New Year holidays, which is kind of like spring break here. So most people are on vacation. Most newspapers aren't publishing right now. The broadcast networks, the state-controlled broadcast networks, are reporting on this. They're reporting on it quite vigorously, it's a new element in Iran's domestic media and political scenario, are these websites, these new websites they are launching, these wire services. They're covering this rather aggressively as well.
Is it the lead story?
I think it is one of a couple lead stories. Absolutely, it's getting a lot of attention. After first few days, they weren't giving a lot of attention, but now it is absolutely getting a lot of coverage. The Iranian government is aggressively getting its narrative out there into the public domain.
Your story, Mr. Deragahi, that you wrote for today's Los Angeles Times was picked up in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It was also picked up in the Baltimore Sun. Here's how it's headed in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Blair to Iran, nobody's fooled. That's what the Philly paper says. And in Baltimore, Iran president wants apology. Are these two different stories?
No, I don't think they're two. I think they're both the same stories. It's just, that happens quite frequently. Sometimes the newspapers pick up our stories, pick up our reporting. They weave it in with stuff from other news services that they subscribe to, and that's really good. That shows that their editors are actually doing their job. They're not just plucking stories out and putting them in. They're reading those stories, going through them, editing them, and playing with them, and doing what they want with them. That's fantastic.
Mr. Deragahi, there was a story this morning in the London Telegraph saying that the British have worked out some type of response or some type of deal with Tehran. Have you heard that?
I've heard that. Sadly, the London press has really collapsed in recent years, and I don't give any of the London newspapers any credibility whatsoever.
Borzu Deragahi is with the Los Angeles Times. We've talked to him frequently when he was in Baghdad. He is now in Tehran, and that's your native city, correct?
Yeah, I was born here, but I moved to the States when I was 4.
Right. And are you there on assignment, or are you there visiting?
Well, it's sort of both. I wouldn't call it visiting. I was here doing some work, and, all of a sudden this thing happened, and so me and our other correspondent here have been working on this story together.
And what's it like to be a reporter in Tehran? Do you feel free to ask any questions, to try to set up interviews with anybody you want?
We do feel free to do that. It's very frustrating. It's very hard to get access to real decision makers here. It's something very similar to how it is reporting in countries like Russia or China, where you're not in danger of being picked up off the street and taken to a prison and tortured or anything. But it's a real high pressure environment. These are not countries that are known for their friendliness towards the craft of journalism.
Borzu Deragahi is our guest, and I'm not sure how long he'll be able to stay with us, but we are also joined here on the set by Niall Gardner. Mr. Gardner is with the Heritage Foundation. He was previously a researcher, advisor to Margaret Thatcher, a foreign policy researcher, advisor. Mr. Gardner, you wrote recently that this latest act of aggression by the brutal, erratic, and highly dangerous regime of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad must not be tolerated. And what do you mean by that?
Well, I think that this is an unacceptable situation. The Iranians have carried out an act of war against Great Britain. They are holding 15 British personnel hostage, and this demands a very vigorous, strong, and also united response from the international community. We cannot tolerate this sort of aggression by a very dangerous regime that is acting in complete violation here of international law. These British personnel were acting on behalf of coalition forces under a UN mandate. They were seized inside Iraqi territorial waters. This is a clear act of aggression by Iran, and there must be a very strong, vigorous response from both the UN Security Council and also, of course, the European Union, as well as NATO in addition to that.
And we're going to come back to you in just a second to define vigorous response and see what you mean. But I want to put the numbers up on the screen. Borzu Daragahi is joining us from Tehran. We have Niall Gardner here on the set with us. But Borzu Daragahi is on our international line. So those of you watching in England or other places, why don't you go ahead and dial the third number down on that screen, which is 628-0205. That's our temporary international line for people living outside the U.S. who would like to comment on this story. Mr. Gardner, what do you mean by vigorous?
Well, I think to start with, we do need to see clear condemnation from the UN Security Council. The Council just issued last week a very simple statement, or a press release actually, which did not even call for the release of the hostages. It was a very watered down statement. What we do need to see from the Security Council is a united position calling for the release of the hostages, condemning Iran's actions, and Britain should have immediately gone to the Security Council as soon as the personnel were taken hostage. Secondly, we need to see the European Union implementing some very strict sanctions towards Tehran. Currently, Iran imports about 40% of its overall imports from the European Union. And we have countries such as France, Germany, Italy implementing huge lucrative export guarantees for their companies investing in Iran. That investment has to end. Thirdly, we need to see also NATO entering the fray and issuing condemnation of Iran's actions. I think this is an issue for the broader NATO alliance. And in addition to that also, I think that Britain needs to make military preparations as a very last resort in the case that diplomacy does not succeed in releasing the hostages.
First call for our guest comes from Holland, Pennsylvania. Democrat, you're on the air. Holland, you with us?
Hello?
Hi.
I certainly agree that this is something that should have a strong response from United Nations and NATO. I also remember that I think it might have been about 6 years ago when the United States aircraft was in the China territory. What it really comes down to is that right now, all of us talking, which thank you for C-SPAN, we have to be very careful that, as you said, sir, they are part of the coalition. And as you said, the United Nations and NATO, and then secondarily European Union, is the way to approach it. Because right now it's just flaming the fuel of the very sad struggle that the American citizens have in between fear and a sense of not wanting war. And I think that it's just so dangerous. I don't blame people for being suspect of the fact that the more that this Iranian it is an international incident, and it should be handled internationally. And I think we need to all remember to pray and to write our representatives and our congressmen.
All right, thank you, caller. Borzu Daragahi, did you hear anything there you'd like to respond to?
Well, I mean, I just think it's a sort of a sad commentary on, with regard to Mr. Ferguson from the, or whatever, the Heritage Foundation gentleman. It's a sad commentary on the bind that the U.S. and Britain have gotten themselves into with regard to Iraq. It's really, really unfortunate that when they go to the European Union and when they go to the Russians and the Chinese, I think to some extent the attitude, and I'm not saying this is necessarily the correct attitude, is you guys got yourself into Iraq. It's a mess. We knew it was going to be trouble from the start. We told you not to get involved. And so they're not going to get involved in this whole issue here because it's seen as part of the larger Iraq quagmire. And, it's unfortunate that because of that, this situation is even possible because the U.S. and British military credibility is so low at this point.
Thank you for that comment. Niall Gardner, anything to add?
I think that's outrageous, actually. I think he seems to be blaming Britain and the United States for this latest incident. This is hostility and aggression by the Iranian regime here. This is not the fault of Great Britain. And I think we are seeing increasing solidarity, actually, within the European Union with the British position. And we are going to have a very intense debate in the coming days and weeks over the issue of stronger sanctions towards the Iranian regime. I think Iran's actions are going to seriously backfire both within the EU and also at the UN Security Council as well. I think the Iranians are finding themselves increasingly isolated, with the exception perhaps of support from Russia and China. But even that support may well break down.
Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, you're on the air.
Yes, good morning.
Hi.
I find it ironic. Here we have the American Enterprise Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the same people that brought us to war with Iraq. These same people are talking now about a real conflagration. If there is anything other than diplomatic action taken against Iran, we are going to blow up the entire Middle East. I think cooler heads must prevail. These right-wingers got to be taken off the radio and off the TV. I get newsletters from Israel. This is about Israel. Israel wants us to get involved. So they couldn't get us involved. So the Brits went into their international waters of Iran. Who doesn't know that? And now you're going to extend this into a worldwide war because you strayed into their waters. They are a sovereign nation, sir.
Borzu Deragahi, has the Israel factor been played up in Tehran?
I mean, I think absolutely. I think that's one of the issues is that when they hear people talking about a possible, there's like a rumor about a possible U.S.-Israeli attack coming to Iran on April 6th. I mean, it's just a wild internet rumor, but it gets a lot of play here. And so there's this sort of sense by the Iranian government that they're totally under siege. And I would just take issue with the Heritage Foundation gentleman. I wasn't at all criticizing Britain. I was just commenting on the sad state of affairs that because of the I told you so attitude on the part of some of the European and Asian partners, there's a certain reluctance to get involved in escalating this. And I think that's a direct result of the conflict in Iraq and the inability to get out of that conflict.
Mr. Deragahi or Mr. Gardner, have any of you seen reaction from some other Middle Eastern countries regarding this?
I haven't seen much response at all, actually, and I think that a great deal will depend upon how, for example, the UN Security Council moves on this issue. But I must respond to the caller earlier from Rehoboth. Firstly, conservatives have every right to be on the airwaves expressing their opinions. The last time I checked, this is a free country. Secondly, the idea that the British were inside Iranian waters is frankly ridiculous. This is a propaganda claim by Tehran. The British have already proven, using satellite imagery and GPS coordinates, that the British forces were inside Iraqi territorial waters. In fact, they were, I believe, 1.7 nautical miles inside Iraq's territory. This is a clear violation by the Iranians, and I don't think that people should be listening to Iranian propaganda over this.
Next call for our guest comes from Manchester, England. You're on the air.
Hi.
Hi.
I don't expect the return of the Marines anytime soon.
Why?
Mainly because I feel that it's they're premeditated to be used as some sort of insurance policy.
Niall Gardner.
Well, that's an interesting point. We're likely to see this hostage crisis continuing for several more weeks. I don't think the Iranians are going to be willing to hand them over immediately. It's going to require a huge amount of international pressure to get those hostages released. So we do need to gird ourselves for a possible long haul with regard to this particular crisis. But the resolve of Great Britain and the United States and the broader international community must be extremely strong at this time. We do have to stand up to this sort of intimidation and send a very clear message that these sorts of actions by a dangerous rogue regime will not be tolerated.
Borzu Deragahi, your former colleague Robin Wright, who's now with the Washington Post, has an article this morning about the Islamic Guard and how they're really a separate entity and that they're the ones who stop the British soldiers and kind of have their own almost run of the country.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point, that there are different factions, different political power centers in Iran that don't necessarily answer to the normal government. There's the Revolutionary Guard, there's a sort of various nonprofit organizations that are basically charities but involved in political work and even paramilitary work, and that's one of the more complicated things about Iran. I think British diplomats in Tehran and even in London definitely understand that. I think that, you know, sometimes in the U.S. there's a sort of tendency to oversimplify and keep talking about the Ahmadinejad regime, and that's sort of, I think, in this context, given the complexities of what is going on domestically in Iran, somewhat unproductive in terms of trying to curry favor with elements that are more moderate and more Western-leaning in the country.
Borzu Deragahi is in Tehran. He's with the Los Angeles Times. Niall Gardner is the director of the Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. He was a foreign policy researcher for former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, has a PhD in history from Yale, and 2 masters from Yale, and a bachelor's and a master's from Oxford. Houston, Texas, Republican, you're on the air.
Good morning. I'd like to agree with your guest there, Niall. He's dead on, in my opinion. Your caller trying to say that the British did this on purpose and went across the lines to create some incident. It's just pure hogwash. And in response to your guest on the phone, Barzouk, I find his response to be a pathetic attempt to spin this against America. I mean, if we're worried about the Europeans, let's talk about oil for food. Nobody's trying to save face. He was just trying not to address the issues. And the most important thing, I've never heard anybody talk about this, these people, and even the article that C-SPAN showed this morning, it said captives. Captives means people were captured. You're captured when you're caught in someone's territory. When you go over the line, it's called kidnapping. The same thing happened when Israel had its problem with Hezbollah. The start of that was when Hezbollah came across the borders of Israel and kidnapped some of the soldiers.
Mr. Gardner.
Well, I think the caller is absolutely right. This is an act of kidnapping here by the Iranians. The British personnel are hostages. The Iranians are acting in clear violation of international law, and this demands a vigorous international response. If we allow the Iranians to get away with this, they will do this time and time again. They will do the same, no doubt, with American forces as well if they get their hands on them. The Iranians are playing a very, very dangerous and risky game. I think, though, that the Iranians do underestimate the strength and determination of the British government, of the British people, to deal with the situation in a very, very strong manner. And I think they underestimate the British people at their peril.
Borzu Deragahi, do you know where the soldiers are being held, or the Navy personnel, and do you have any access to them?
We presume that they're being held somewhere in Tehran. No journalists have had access to them, and no consular officials have had access to them, despite the attempts by the hardworking British diplomats here to try to get access to them.
Salina, Kansas, Democrat.
Yes, good morning.
Hi.
Mr. Now keeps on saying that the international community should deal with them. This has not gotten us anywhere in Iraq. I think we need to let diplomacy work its way through. War is not going to solve any problem.
Thank you for your comment. Overland Park, Kansas.
Yeah, I have 2 points, actually. One quick one. I heard a report of confrontation between Iranian forces and U.S. and Iraqi forces inside of Iraq around the same time as the UK sailors got kidnapped, and I haven't heard any more comments about that. It seems like a pre-planned strategy by Iran to provoke these things. But my other comment was, I've seen reports from the Indian flagged ship that the British were searching, and the captain of that ship says they were clearly in Iraqi waters. I've seen Iraqi fishermen who are in the area, and their reports were all that they were clearly in Iraqi waters. And so it kind of says when the news reports, well, Iran says this, the UK says this, but when you have independent observers around who support one side or the other, it gives more weight to one side or the other, and it's not merely a Iran says this, the UK says that kind of thing.
Niall Gardner.
Well, I think that's an excellent point, actually. Only the Iranians are saying that the British were in Iranian waters. And we are dealing with a regime that lies time and time again, that is causing a huge amount of trouble inside Iraq, that is sowing the seeds of division inside Iraq itself, and has a vested interest in trying to stoke the fires here. And so we cannot take the Iranians at their word. This is a regime that is led by an extremely brutal set of people here who are determined to spark some sort of regional confrontation here, who are determined to place the British and the Americans in the position of aggressor. The Iranians here are the clear aggressors, and they must answer now to the broader international community for their actions.
Do you see this going on for several months?
Yes, I do.
And at what point, in your view, should the British change tactics?
I think that the British are going to certainly continue the use of diplomacy, but on the broader international stage. I think their main focus now will be certainly at the United Nations and also within the EU as well. We'll also see, I think, a greater degree of cooperation between the United States and Great Britain on this particular issue. As we saw yesterday, President Bush issued some very strong statements. I think that if the hostages are in any real danger, if there's an indication, for example, that the Iranians are going to harm them in any way, I think at that stage the British may decide that enough is enough and that some sort of military intervention is warranted. However, we're certainly not at that stage yet. But in the meantime, I believe that the British will make military preparations for a worst-case scenario. But the British tactic here certainly is to work through the broader international community to try to get this issue solved through the UN Security Council in particular, to try and force the Iranians to back down. The use of force certainly is out there, but it's definitely a very last resort.
Is Tony Blair's planned step down as Prime Minister, does that have a role in this situation?
I don't think that's going to really affect the situation. I think that once Gordon Brown comes into power, I don't think he's significantly going to change the approach that Tony Blair has adopted here. However, there is growing disquiet inside the United Kingdom over a perceived weakness on the part of the initial negotiating strategy by the British, and Blair has been coming under some fire from critics who charge that he's not being tough enough. So I do think that Blair is going to strengthen his position on this particular issue, even though domestically he is somewhat of a lame duck with just 2 or 3 months to go in office.
Next call comes from Hammond, Indiana, Republican line.
Good morning, Mr. Gardner. I just think you are a brilliant man. I listen to you all the time when you're on various shows, and I just think you're brilliant. I was just wondering, this was bound to happen because everybody's given them a free ride all these years. No one has enough guts to stand up and say, this is not going to go on, we've had enough. And now what do you think about the left and the Democrats now are in charge here, and all the bad rhetoric going around, and it's weakened our position. Same with Britain. Everyone has to be a nice guy and just roll along and let's not confront. Now we have the poor British sailors and Marines. They're held hostage. That these aren't captives; they're hostages. Now, when is someone going to say enough's enough? I've had it. And also, one last thing, I would like to hear your comment on what do you think about that goofball Pelosi over in Syria? I mean, that goofball has no business over there.
Got your point. Thanks, caller. Niall Gardner.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for your very kind comments. I think that with regard to what's happening on Capitol Hill and the message being sent by Congress with regard to Iraq, I think this is really undermining the broader war effort, both on the part of the United States and Great Britain inside Iraq at this time, sending completely the wrong signals. And I think that this is certainly a time for solidarity between the United States and the United Kingdom. I would like to see more lawmakers on Capitol Hill, particularly Democrats actually expressing support for the British over this particular issue. I think that Nancy Pelosi's trip over to Syria, or meeting with Syrian officials, sends completely the wrong signal. It's undermining, I think, the broader efforts to deal with both Iran and Syria, two very, very dangerous, hostile, rogue regimes, state-sponsored terrorism. We certainly do not want to be negotiating with these regimes at all. And I think that certainly the Democrats need to be sending a stronger message of solidarity with the British at this time. They're certainly not doing so at the moment.
Borzu Deragahi, how are the news commentators in Tehran referring to the soldiers? Are they referring to them as hostages, as invaders?
As sailors.
As sailors, straightforward.
Yeah, pretty straightforward, yeah.
Okay.
The British sailors.
Next call comes from, are there any comparisons being made to 1979 in the U.S. hostage situation? Has that been raised?
I think there's been some comparisons made to that situation. Again, you know, you had there's a couple parallels, although there's a lot of differences. And one of the main parallels is you had a very weak West at that time. If you recall, you know, the economy of the U.S. was rather weak. We were just getting over the hangover of the Vietnam War back then, and we're, you know, sadly in a sort of a similar situation right now because of the ongoing crisis in Iraq. And there's also another sort of parallel with 1979. As it is now, you had a sort of very divided Iranian government with various factions jostling for power and an attempt on the part of some of the hardliners to silence the more moderate voices. That's happened then, and it's happening now.
Benton Harbor, Michigan, independent.
Yes, I agree with Tony Blair so far. I think that diplomacy is the answer. I don't think bombs and bullets are the answer to every situation that arises. Also, I just had a question for your guests. If China invaded us and if Mexico and Canada tried to help, would they be considered terrorists and insurgents? Thank you for letting me on.
Niall Gardner, any comment?
I don't think that China is planning to invade the United States anytime soon, actually. I don't think that it's a terribly realistic scenario.
Nelson County, Kentucky, Democrat.
Hello?
Hi.
Yes, I'm a first-time caller. Thank you very much for taking my call. I'm also a Vietnam veteran, fought with the Marine Corps. First off, it seems to me that the facts of events like this often are years down the road before they surface. And secondly, Great Britain's history in that area is atrocious. John F. Kennedy told the Prime Minister of England that when the Iraqis reclaimed the oil fields, that he considered it justice because they had been stealing from those people for years. So I think maybe this event possibly will get England involved when we attack Iran.
Now, Gardner?
Well, firstly, I don't think Britain has an atrocious record in the Middle East. I think it is a record of tremendous honor and dignity, of which I think the British people are proud. I think that, secondly, we're not talking at this stage about some sort of immediate war against Iran. We are talking about applying very intense international pressure. The use of force is certainly always there on the table. But I don't think we're at the stage right now where we're going to be seeing bombs flying towards Tehran. The fate of the Iranian regime certainly is in their own hands, actually, and they need to understand that they are playing a very, very dangerous game here, and they certainly do need to back down.
Borzu Deragahi, any comments?
Oh, well, I mean, I would just say that it's just a very complicated situation here, and I mean, all of this stuff is under dispute. Your guest from the think tank says that they were clearly in Iraqi waters. I tend to think so, just from my analysis. But the whole boundary has been under dispute for 30 years. I mean, there's people who've spent their whole lives studying this, studying the Shatt al-Arab waterway, and trying to figure out where the Iranian side begins, where the Iraqi side begins. The way that the Iranian government has handled this situation is, I mean, it appears to violate, at the very minimum, the standards for treating prisoners or captives of any situation. But I'm not sure at this point, given the complexities of what's going on in Iran right now domestically, that upping the pressure, increasing the diplomatic sort of stranglehold on Iran after, already putting a pretty strong UN Security Council resolution against Iran for its nuclear program, I don't think it's going to be productive. I think it might have the opposite effect. It's been the flooding of the Persian Gulf with military hardware by the U.S., Britain, and even France that's kind of backed Iran into a corner and made them lash out in what many see as a completely irrational way.
Borzu Deragahi, who do you think ordered the taking of the sailors?
I mean, it's totally unclear whether, but it makes a big difference in the end, whether it was just a sort of incident on the seas or whether there was a political motive involved. I think some people believe, I'm sure your think tank person believes that it was ordered from on high, but it's very possible that it was just an incident that happened on the seas, and then the political leadership tried to take advantage of it and up the ante, so to speak. And I think it almost doesn't matter who ordered it, because it's definitely become conflated with the broader confrontation between the Iranians and the rest of the world.
Wyandotte, Michigan, you are the last call for our guests.
Good morning. I'd just like to let the people in England know we may have cowards in charge of America right now, but it's not because we voted them in. It's because we set out that election to punish our conservatives who were not conservatives. As for Iran, we know we've had this trouble since '79. So this is a war that Jimmy Carter passed on to the next generation.
Niall Gardner, final comment, or final question. What is the U.S. role, in your view, in this issue?
Well, I think the United States is going to play an increasingly important role. We have seen the U.S. deferring to the British over the past few days or so, I think really at the request of the British government. But President Bush's statement yesterday, a strong condemnation of the Iranians, calling for the immediate release of the hostages, I think it certainly marks the beginning of a greater U.S. role in this particular issue. And we are likely to see greater U.S.-UK coordination in terms of dealing with the hostages. I don't think it's an issue that the British can deal with on their own. Britain does need a very strong support from the United States and also, of course, the broader international community. And so I would expect to see increasingly a coordinated response from London and Washington on this particular issue.
And Borzu Deragahi, is there a fear in Iran that if these sailors are released, after that there may come a military response?
I think that's part of the problem, is that there is no fear. And that's part of the calculus that's gone into the Iranian steps here, is that they're basically calling the bluff of they think that they're calling the bluff of the Britons and the Americans. They think that the Britons and the Americans have been so battered and drained by the situations in Iraq and Afghanistan that neither their publics nor their militaries have the stomach for a military escalation. And they're, to some extent, just thumbing their noses at the U.S. and the Britons, saying, look, you're this big, huge, mighty power, but you've gotten yourself into such a predicament that our, little Navy can come and capture 15 of your guys, and you can't do anything about it.
Two final questions. Have you been over to the British Embassy, and what's the atmosphere there in Tehran?
I go over to the British Embassy twice a week to play football on their very nice.
Real football or European football?
Soccer, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So yeah, and I'm in touch with the British embassy people, and they're working really hard on this issue and trying to work their connections to try to figure out at the very least where these guys are and whether they can get a consular visit. That's their priority here.
And you were in Baghdad, what, a month or so ago? Did you travel straight from Baghdad to Tehran, or more circuitous?
I had a vacation 5 days in Dubai.
Okay, all right. Borzu Deragahi is in Tehran. He's with the Los Angeles Times, as always. Thank you. Niall Gardner is head of the Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Topic of Sudan is our last half hour. We'll be right back.
Everyone who was fighting this war believed that they were fighting the right fight. Knowing 1 minute that you had a family and knowing that you're the only one left was so severe that I wished I had been there to die with them. If you second guess anything that you were doing, the commanders will actually kill you. You know, children who cried for their mothers were shot immediately.
Swept into Sierra Leone's civil war at age 12, it's hard to imagine he even survived. Tonight at 8 on C-SPAN's Q&A, Ishmael Baya tells his story in A Long Way Gone, Memoirs of a Boy Soldier. You can also listen to Q&A on C-SPAN Radio or online as a C-SPAN podcast. This weekend on Book TV, today at noon, author and journalist Alexander Coburn is our guest on our live monthly 3-hour series, In Depth. And then President Nixon's Deputy Special Assistant Bruce Hershenson looks at Taiwan, its conflict with China, and U.S. policy at 3. That's this weekend on Book TV. For a complete listing of Book TV programming, go online to booktv.org.